welcome to our largest ever Food Thinkers. Thank you very, very much for coming. My name is Corinna Hawkes. I'm the Director of the Centre for Food Policy and Professor here. And I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you all here this evening, and especially given what fantastic guest speakers we have this evening. So Food Thinkers is part of the main work of the Centre for Food Policy. Part of our mission, as you can see here, is to advance integrated food policies which cut across government, which cut across supply chains and the food system, and which have multiple benefits across the food system. And the Food Thinkers is a space where people come together and discuss how we do that, and the ideas around that, and how we can sort of think about putting it into practice. And we learn from this process. We take notes and think about what you say as well as what the speakers say, and think about it as we go forward with our scholarship, with our teaching, and with our engagement work. So thanks for coming and enriching us this evening. It does mean that we like to focus on discussion. We expect you, I haven't told you this, but we expect, come in Eric. There's space here. We do expect you to come up with some hard questions for the speakers. And also, if you don't have a question but you have a comment, to comment on what has been said. So very much a space for open discussion, for transparency. No one should be afraid to say what they feel or what they think. This is a space for open discussion. So I'm really pleased to be welcoming Boyd Swinburn and Anne Marie Thow this evening. Boyd Swinburn is somebody who has been tremendously influential in the world of obesity prevention. Certainly he was a major influence over my own work, and I'm very proud to have got to know him in the last 10 years or so. He's a great guy. He is Professor of Population Nutrition and Global Health at the University of Auckland, and also a Professor at Deakin University. He has published hundreds and hundreds of things, mentored many PhD students, advised the WHO, and including Anne Marie actually, and been a great mentor to many of us. He set up the Informus initiative, which monitors food environments around the world. He coined the term obesogenic environments, and he is currently the chair of the Lancet Commission on Obesity, which I'm privileged to be a member of, which he's going to be talking about this issue of integration. So Boyd has been just doing a lot of thinking in the last couple of years about how to bring obesity into the world of undernutrition, into the world of climate change, and how to take this more integrated approach. And this kind of more integrated thinking is actually an approach that Anne Marie Thow, who's from the University of Sydney, has been taking throughout her career. And one of Boyd's PhD students, but has established herself very, very rapidly as a great thinker in this area of trying to think about how we have food systems that actually work for nutrition. I was proud to get to know Anne Marie when she interned for me at the International Food Policy Research Institute over a decade ago, I guess now. A long time ago now, so I've known them both a while. So the focus of this then is going to be about the integration between obesity and undernutrition. That's the focus, and how we can try and bring these agendas together in a way which actually works for policy. So I'm going to ask Boyd to speak first, and then Anne Marie for 20 minutes or so. The session runs until 7. So there should be plenty of time for questions. We actually have the room booked till 8. So if you want to stick around and discuss things with each other, please feel free to stay around a little bit longer. We want to share the thinking around integrated food policy with the world. So do feel free to tweet out any thoughts that you're having to generate a conversation. And I think that's all on the housekeeping. Sorry. That's right, sorry. I have to tell you that it is being live streamed at this point in time. When we go to questions, I will run around with a microphone, so please do make sure that when you do ask questions, use the microphone and obviously introduce yourself and say where you're from. And I'll hand over to Boyd.
Just before I take down the logo, I've just had the logo explained to me about the Venn diagrams and integrated thinking. So congratulations on your Venn diagrams. All right. Okay, I'm going to come and stand over here. So listen, thank you very much indeed, Corinna, for inviting me to talk to this group and for people to come out on an evening to hear Anne Marie and myself. Before I start, I should just mention that City University has been hounded a little bit from a posse back in New Zealand consisting of the Food and Grocery Council and their PR guy and a blogger insisting that I let you know that I'm suing them for defamation, just as a statement of conflict of interest around some of the things they've been saying about me. Anyway, on to malnutrition. Malnutrition in all its forms and this policy integration that Corinna has quite rightly identified as one of the real challenges within nutrition. And some of you may have heard about the new nutrition science, that sort of idea that came around about, was it a decade or so ago, thinking about nutrition more than just molecules and nutrients, and it's about people, it's about society, it's about environment, and so on. And that was kind of the start of trying to bring this idea of nutrition expanding a bit more. Well, it's expanding even more now, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how we've been thinking about it. So the SDG goals, by their very nature, have been are integrated, and they require joined up work. And while the SDG goal for nutrition is fairly clear, it talks about malnutrition in all its forms. And that is the start of this kind of integrated thinking, and it's in many of the other SDGs as well. So it's not just sitting there by itself in one SDG. The problem is that nutrition looks like this. We're in silos. We're operating in our own little world, and how do we join these up to be able to get impact on SDGs and those other development goals? So I just want to talk a little bit about obesity and undernutrition first, because this is a pretty clear way that we can start integrating, and it's been an interesting journey. This is the data for stunting in children and under 5s. You can see it's been coming down over the last few decades, particularly in the Asian area, but still problematic in Africa. And at the same time, we have this is obesity in under 5s, but this is adult obesity. So in many middle-income countries, low-income countries as well, as they have all of the institutions and the funding and the people and the capacity aimed at trying to bring this down, at the same time, running up behind them is this beast of obesity and chronic disease and diabetes coming up to bite them. And they haven't really even sorted out what to do about the undernutrition yet, and they've got to deal with this other thing that's rapidly rising. And so that's a problem. That's a systemic change for them to sort of change direction in that. And one of the ways of being able to do it is to try to say, actually, these are part of the same thing. Because in the early days when we started, when diabetes and obesity started appearing in these countries, the undernutrition people were rather worried that this was now going to swamp all this work that they're doing, that it wasn't completely finished. So one way of doing it is to say this is part of a single entity. In a country like Malaysia or Indonesia, you've got the single food system, which is supporting both a high level of undernutrition and obesity at the same time. And it's occurring not only within populations, within villages, within households, but even within individuals. So there's a study of 36 low middle income countries. 10% of the stunted children were also overweight. And this problem of stunted children becoming overweight became evident actually in Chile as they were doing their undernutrition programs and measuring children mainly by weight for age without realizing that their programs were actually helping to contribute to obesity because they hadn't thought about the whole thing collectively and were producing shorter, fatter children, which is not what they were aiming to do. So I think there's a great danger in operating in these silos. This is a diagram taken from the Global Nutrition Report from last year that Corinna put together, and these kinds of diagrams I think are really helpful in trying to help us to understand why are these things connected, how are they connected, what is the picture. And most of them carry, oops, I hope you can see that, carry a similar kind of pattern starting at the top with the outcomes. So we're talking about NCDs and infection and so on. Positive nutrition outcomes that support both of those, coming down to a behavioural, biological process, which is called intermediate processes, followed by a set of environments which determine the expression of the biology and the manifestation of the behaviours. And underlying those are a set of much deeper, much more systemic common drivers. Now, I think we can quite readily make the case of at the behavioural level, and there's quite a lot of work being done at the biological level and even food environments. When you get down to this area and things like trade, urbanisation, globalisation of food systems, this becomes actually quite difficult territory to be able to explain and use that as the, if you like, the map or the framework for which to bring people together. So that's part of the challenge that we've taken on within the Lancet Commission for Obesity, is how do we create that dialogue, that framework, that description, that narrative that will allow us to deal with multiple outcomes at once. Oops. So let me just also at this stage bring in climate change. So I've talked about overweight and obesity. I've talked about undernutrition. Both of those obviously very dependent on food systems, urban systems, urban development, transport systems, land use, and so on. But actually so is climate change. And if you look at, this is from the IPCC, the health impacts at a stage that we're +4 degrees. The biggest impact is going to be undernutrition, food insecurity through major weather events and droughts and so on. So actually this is the hardcore part of undernutrition, and this is the part that is potentially modifiable if we act in time. But the point is that climate change is another fundamental, huge global problem that is actually intimately related with nutrition. We need to be able to integrate those as they're trying to do in the SDGs. And just to put a personal perspective on it, these two kids are my grandchildren. They're going to be around when we're talking +4 degrees at the end of the century. The people who are going to have to deal with this are living right now, and you know this is a very, even though it may not feel acute, this is actually an emergency in my view. So one of the ways we're trying to think about joining these things up and integrating them is through this concept of syndemics. Now this has been applied in other areas, not in nutrition. It's been applied mainly in HIV, but it's where you get two diseases or epidemics, two or more, occurring at the same time with interactions and with common drivers. And as I said, it's been mainly around the issue of HIV, drugs and violence, and a lot of these interactions are at the individual level. But is this a way of thinking about obesity, undernutrition, and climate change? And, if we're going to do that, then we're going to need to start calling or thinking about climate change as an epidemic. Now, I presented this yesterday at a workshop, and an epidemiologist jumped up and down and said, you can't call climate change an epidemic. I say, well, in the general wide view of epidemics, like we have epidemics of crime and so on, it's something that is changing over time. It's got a time course. The dynamic part is important for an epidemic. It's going to have major health effects, and I think it's actually quite helpful to think about it in epidemic terms. Anyway, we have climate change as an epidemic and interactions both at individual and population level, and maybe this is a way of having a collective narrative. So undernutrition, we know from the biology through the developmental origins of health and disease that children that are exposed to undernutrition in intrautero and infancy will are more at risk of developing diabetes. Climate change, as I've shown you through food insecurity, is going to be a risk. So these things interact. Exactly what climate change is going to do to obesity, I don't know, but I'm sure there'll be some interaction there. So these things do interact, and they do have common drivers. The common drivers that we can think about, the immediate ones that drive the environments that we operate in, the food environment, the transport environment, land use and urban design. Those systems dictate the environments that we link with, and these are dictated by common underlying drivers. The economics, the rules that are set up, that will determine what these systems look like, which in turn determines our behaviours and our response to our biology. So can we sort of go back, I guess, into the deeper systemic causes and say to people operating in undernutrition and in climate change and in obesity, we're all operating with the same problem, and let's see if we can work together on that. So, sorry, before I go on to that, the issue that we're struggling with in the obesity world is that we have a problem which is escalating in all countries and all regions, about 2 percentage points per decade. It's going up. We also have a problem of policy resistance. So in other words, despite the fact that we've got piles of recommendations from authoritative bodies like WHO, they are not being kind of implemented. So we're left with this problem that's increasing, and we're left with a set of policy resistant mechanisms, and I think both of those have systemic origins. They're both of them sitting within here. We need to identify what those are. So, in terms of joining these things up, we're borrowing some of the wording that Corinna used around double duty actions, and this is one of the ways of joining up and creating policy coherence. If you can show and say, if you do this, then you will have double wins or triple wins. This is win-win or win-win-win type situations. And that's where I think we need to be aiming for in terms of telling the narrative. So with malnutrition in all its forms, when we went out and had a look and saw what are the number of recommendations, there's actually lots of them. There's over 100 recommendations for what should be done. When we looked at physical activity environments and how to increase physical activity, WHO's just put out a document now, and there's about 50 recommendations in there. When we looked at climate change and said, what does the IPC say about what government should do, specifically for climate change, actually they don't say anything. They just give evidence statements, and countries have to work it out. So I think the climate change world does not have nearly as many specified actions that should be done to reduce it as the nutrition world. But nevertheless, when you think about some of the areas of where there can be double or triple duty actions, if we can articulate these, if we can show the size of the wins, then I think we're on a pathway to joining up teams. So if you think about health and environmental impact assessments, for example, within building and transport design, that will have multiple benefits. Trade agreements which preserve policy space so that governments are free to make rules and regulations, that will help with undernutrition, climate change. Management of conflicts of interest and transparency. For agricultural research, shifting to diversified, sustainable crops away from something like the 80% of research that goes on to 4 grains or 5 grains, shifting it into other research that will have benefits for undernutrition, climate change and obesity. Protecting peri-urban lands, agricultural policies which have nutrition and environmental purposes. Just on that, I do remember some time ago, must have been 6 or 7 years ago, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, there was a meeting in WHO with FAO, and they started talking about how do we join up these two worlds, and the sort of the wording or the feeling that was coming across from WHO was, could we please just have some agricultural policies that are maybe a little bit sensitive to nutrition? And so it was just sort of gently asking the question whether agricultural policies could have nutrition outcomes. And I have to say I found it quite astounding. It was my first kind of interaction with agriculture, and it struck me how different their thinking is and their operations are compared to us. So anyway, I think in the last few years we've actually come some distance for that. Even dietary guidelines, do they have environmental and social aspects included in them so that when you talk about diet and diet recommendations, you're thinking about all these dimensions. That gets people on the same page. We've taken a look at the number of recommendations in nutrition from recent authoritative documents, mainly from WHO, the UN system, and there's a lot of them. There's 190 of these suckers. That's a lot of stuff for governments to implement. It's far too many, actually. But many of these, when we analyse them, will be double duty actions. When you look at things like food access and food affordability, some of these things which are a little bit more systemic, around trade agreements and sector engagement and so on, they will help both undernutrition and obesity. But this is a job of work to go through these things and articulate exactly what they are, what these wins are, what the benefits are, what the economic benefits are, and so on. And the same is true also for the effects of this on climate change. And I think once we start doing that and start applying our analytic work to this kind of thing, then I think we'll start have the data to be able to join up these groups. Just a word on policy resistance, this policy resistance that we're seeing in obesity. It is due to, in a large degree, to government reluctance, both through their own ideology and also the reluctance through regulatory chill, not wanting to do the battles with the food industry. There's obviously food industry pushback, but there's actually also insufficient public demand for policies. And if we want to shift this policy resistance, we better pay attention to this part of it as well, as opposed to this part that we tend to focus on. How do we mobilise public demand, civil society demand for policy action? We need to get the narrative, we need to get the story to be able to create that. Okay, let me just tell you just for a couple of minutes on some of the work we've been doing around systems thinking, because this is not the systems thinking and the systems science, not a panacea for everything, but I've, in my experience with it, and I'm not an expert in it, but my experience is that this is a very engaging process where people can come together and put their mind maps together. They can work on common maps, common determinants, common solutions, and I think it's a potential pathway for joining people up. So for those of you not familiar with systems thinking, it considers the whole as well as the parts, the connections, the networks, feedback loops, delays. It's very dynamic. It's about self-organizing and adaptation and complexity. So it's got a whole language, a whole lot of tools, a whole lot of thinking within that I think needs to come into health. It's been sitting in engineering and business and ecology for decades. This is a pile of sand. If you cut it in half, it's still a pile of sand. You cut it in half again, it's still a pile of sand. This isn't a system, but this is a system. It's a cow. You can't cut it in half and still have a cow. This is a system. You know, this is not a pile of sand. This is more than a pile of sand. There's the whole is more than the sum of the parts, and this thing here is actually more like that than it is in system terms than it is like that. So thinking about the whole is actually critically important in systems thinking, and that's an embracing way of engaging people within the whole systems. And one of the ways we've been doing it, at least at the community level, we've found to be extremely engaging, where people come with a particular problem that they want to deal with. And this one was around childhood obesity. You put it on the table, childhood obesity. What do you think the causes are? People start downloading their mental maps of this is a problem and it causes that. This is a problem and it causes that. And they start building these maps. And they just lay them out there, just whatever comes to their head. And they start drawing arrows and circles, and it becomes a total mess. And then it turns into something a little bit more pretty. And in the end, it turns into a diagram, a full systems map of a town, this is in southern Victoria, where they have built this, and they've got people from multiple sectors, from education, from local government, from health, and so on, to come together to build it. And the sports guys can see where they operate, and there's physical activity up here, and social attitudinal things, and health and drink. So people can kind of see where they sit, and they've helped create it, and therefore they own it and it's theirs. And this thing sits up, you know, this is their map, this is their plan for action within Portland. And all these green dots are the action points that they're doing within it. So this is a kind of coherent way of kind of cohering it. And if there's things where you don't have people in the room, and they need to be in the room, like apparently the water in Portland tastes shit, and that's why the kids won't drink it. So let's talk to the water engineers. Well, the water engineers weren't in the room in the first place, because what have they got to do with childhood obesity? But you know, if you go and talk to them and say, this is part of the problem up here, and the problem with water tastes bad is part of the reason for it, and say, oh God, is that right? Well, we better see what we can kind of do about it. So then water engineers become part of the issue, part of the solution. So, you know, it is an engaging process, and I don't quite know how it would work at large levels. This is how it operates within small communities. I'll skip that. So just to summarise, I think we have a bunch of silos. We tend to work in silos. Silos are not necessarily all bad. You know, it helps us concentrate on what the hell we're doing. But at a global level, when we're trying to shift big problems, actually we need to break them down, and addressing the systemic causes of malnutrition in all its forms is one way, so long as we can articulate that and get the story and get the data out there about what the double and triple wins are. Joining up with other silos, I've talked about agriculture, but obviously treasury, education, business, and so on. The strategies for integrating, I think that at the moment we're seeing the high-level framing through SDGs, through the Decade of Action on Nutrition. They are framing it in a holistic way. So at the high level, it's up there, malnutrition in all its forms. What we haven't done is translate that down to what that means specifically in policies and practice, which I think we have to do. Analysing these double and triple duty solutions, the frameworks, those linear frameworks that I showed for understanding the layers of determinants, that might help us think deeper. The concept of syndemics, maybe that's a concept that we can pull people together and say, okay, we've got these co-occurring epidemics, let's work on the commonalities and the intersections. And the systems approaches, which are participatory and allow people to put their thoughts in, put their ideas in, and own the result and work on it. So it does need the right framing. It needs the stories and examples to go along with it. It needs the high-level commitment and the stakeholder pressure. So we got a job of work to do. Anne Marie's going to tell you how to do it all.
Thank you very much, Corinna, for the invite to come and talk. And thank you very much, Boyd, particularly for your introduction to the problem. This is a picture of me with a very good friend of mine in Delhi. And I just wanted to start with a bit of a story about her neighbourhood. And in her neighbourhood, it's very common for this double burden of malnutrition that Boyd described so well to exist, even at the household level. Far from India's history of reeling from famines and from acute hunger and malnutrition, the nutritional situation in India now looks like it does in much of the world. 30 to 40% of children display signs of chronic undernourishment in the form of stunting. 80% of pregnant women have iron deficiency anemia. 80%. I was absolutely shocked at that. And rates of diet-related chronic diseases are escalating. When I went and talked to nutritionists in Delhi who were working in neighbourhoods like this, they described to me a situation that was intimately bound up with the food supply. They described young mothers consuming diets that were largely cheap calories, refined carbohydrate and fat. They described to me young children being weaned onto cheap cookies. The mothers would tell them, we know this is a really good thing to feed our child because we see it advertised. We see that it's got milk, it's got grains. We know this is a really good thing. Of course, the nutritionists are basically crying as they're telling me this because there's basically nothing worse that you could wean your child onto than cheap cookies. When I started to talk to policymakers in India who govern the food supply, I started to understand where this food supply was coming from. Why, on the one hand, we have these global calls for improved nutrition that focus on high-quality diets to combat all forms of malnutrition, while we have a food supply that's delivering primarily cheap calories. So what I want to do in this talk is talk a little bit about that policy incoherence that we see, really following on from what Boyd's been describing about this pervasive challenge of addressing malnutrition in all its forms, which we're increasingly recognising as fundamentally linked by this food supply. Governments are really interested in this. I think I would agree with Boyd that there is this widespread interest in improving the food supply, in delivering nutritious diets to people, okay? And the way that governments do this is, for example, in Fiji, their Fiji Plan of Action on Nutrition, is addressing nutrition as a multi-sectoral issue, in having policies that look to provide accessible, affordable and attractive healthy food, sustainable production that inform consumers and give them the opportunity to make educated choices, and that provide supportive settings in which people make these decisions. What you'll notice about this policy document, though, is the fact that at the bottom, it's a Ministry of Health document, okay? And what the challenge we see, ooh, that is speedy, sorry. The challenge that we see is actually that to achieve these policies, you need to have policy change in the sectors outside of health. So while the Fiji Plan of Action on Nutrition does identify an enormous raft, I've spent a lot of time working on this document, enormous raft of policies that they would like to see implemented by agriculture, commerce, finance, trade, Ministry of Sports, Ministry of Women, Ministry of Social Development. It is a Ministry of Health document, okay? And when you actually look at the policies then across the sectors that govern the food supply, we don't see this policy change being taken up. It's exactly what Boyd was just talking about as policy resistance in the sectors that govern the food supply. This is why we have a food supply that is delivering cheap calories rather than nutritional quality. So what I want to do is look briefly at some of these incoherences that I've seen in the work that I've been doing, and then to start to talk about what it might look like to have more coherence in policy making across sectors such that we could deliver high nutritional quality rather than what we currently have. So fundamentally, when we talk about changing policy in this sort of way, we're talking about political economy. Okay, why do we see this policy resistance? Why do we see this very slow adoption of these policies across sectors? It's basically because we see food supply policies pursuing different policy objectives than health policies. And what I'm going to do is draw on John Kingdon's theory of policy making, which I really quite like, where he highlights 3 really critical factors in what determines policy agendas. He highlights understanding of the problem, policy solutions, so what solutions are on the table, and the politics that exist. So the first incoherence that I want to highlight is one that really resonates with Boyd's comments about how we understand the problem. In most countries in the world which are coming out of a situation in which the problem was lack of food, the problem was hunger and acute malnutrition, we see a really impressive policy architecture which was responding to that problem. Okay, but as we know, the problem has changed. Okay, so the policies that exist in these food supply sectors, these policies that in the Indian context are delivering cheap calories, they were actually designed for a problem that no longer exists. And in some way, I think we need to celebrate them, because that problem was actually a significant part of addressing it was that increased availability through technological investment, through all sorts of food supply investment in delivering calories. Okay, but now, as I said, the problem is very different. We're looking at chronic undernutrition. We're looking at stunting. We're looking basically at problems that reflect of low nutritional quality diets. This issue of nutritional quality is really critical. I think Derek Heady made a really good point about this when he described the way that the policymakers in the food supply sectors think as calorie fundamentalism. That when you say to somebody who's working in agriculture or commerce or trade in most countries of the world, and you talk to them about improving nutrition, they say, I don't understand, we already are. So basically what we see here is a policy incoherence that stems from this misunderstanding of the problem. The second incoherence that I want to talk about is the fact that the policy solutions that we would like to see implemented in these food supply sectors are responding to very different imperatives. They're responding to economic imperatives. I was recently talking to policymakers in South Africa, and they would say to me, look, we appreciate the importance of nutritional quality. We work in agriculture or commerce, we understand that this is a huge problem and that it entails a significant economic burden for South Africa. Their NCD epidemic is alarming. However, in our National Development Plan, our government has headlined with the fact that they're going to create 11 million jobs for the people of South Africa by 2030. That's what we need to do. So when we make our investment policies, when we make our agriculture policies, we're focused on employment and rural development, because these are our economic policy priorities. And I think in understanding how we can get nutrition on the agenda in these food supply sectors, we need to actually understand what it is that they're trying to do and what their key performance indicators are, the imperatives that they are responding to. Fundamentally, these are not about nutritional quality at this point in time. The third incoherence that I want to talk about is actually taking a step in a slightly different direction. The previous two that I talked about are really about what's generating the problem. The third incoherence that I want to talk about is about the politics, the fact that when we start to try to implement solutions delivering nutritional quality in these food supply sectors, we're actually constrained in our ability to do so by the fact that these countries have signed on to binding international economic agreements that don't always allow this change to happen. So an example of this, some work I've been doing recently on trade, it's really interesting. I want to talk a bit about Indonesia, because Indonesia at the moment is effectively being pinched at both ends. Indonesia has a food security policy where they are providing subsidised grains to low-income people, which is an agricultural subsidy. Every time the Committee on Agriculture meets at the World Trade Organization, Indonesia is being queried about the subsidies that they're providing for food security purposes. Indonesia is also very cognizant of their double burden of malnutrition, and they recently proposed interpretive nutrition labelling to inform consumers about risks associated with diet-related chronic disease. That nutrition labelling policy is also under discussion at the WTO because it's a technical barrier to trade, because it was going to be a mandatory interpretive label that sat on the front of the packaged food in Indonesia, okay? So this is the kind of incoherence that we see, where even when countries are able to get nutrition on the agenda of these sectors that govern the food supply chain, they're not actually allowed to do that. So now I want to talk a bit about what happens next. So what if this is what the problem looks like from a policy and a political economy perspective, what is it that we can do about it? And I want to talk about each of these three dimensions of policy agendas: the problem, the policies, and the politics. So the first issue, I think, is reframing the problem. And Boyd introed this really effectively. I think one of the really significant challenges is this fact that when you talk to these policymakers who are economists thinking about calories, they actually literally don't understand. I've talked to the Central Planning Agency in India, and the guy was like, I don't understand. We are doing something about nutrition. We have our public distribution system, which delivers mainly white rice to people and creates incentives for production of white rice. You know, this is great, okay? What is it that you want us to do? We're already solving the problem of nutrition. And also, we can't be talking about overnutrition until we've fixed undernutrition, you know, which obviously starts to generate this situation which you're just continually pumping calories into a population that no longer have that problem. So we need to start to reframe this problem. And I actually would also second Boyd's shout out to Karina's Global Nutrition Report, because I think this is one of the key examples of reframing that's happening in the global space at the moment, where we're starting to have this consistent dialogue, this consistent policy frame coming out of the nutrition community, which is articulating the problem as one of nutritional quality that is required for both undernutrition and diet-related chronic disease prevention, as well as obviously nutritional deficiencies. The second aspect of reorienting food systems, how we get nutritional quality on the agenda, needs to think about the policy solutions. And here, I really can't emphasize enough that what we want to see is really specific and concrete policy solutions. I'll give you an example about taxation, partly because I know Oliver's in the room. But you know, when I started working on taxation about 10 years ago, I really noticed that what was interesting when you reviewed the academic literature recommending fiscal policy, for example, taxes on soft drinks to combat diet-related NCDs, is that you saw a lot of recommendations which were just administratively completely unfeasible. So things that like doubling the value-added tax or creating these odd little taxes that sat outside the existing taxation system. And what struck me was that there was this ongoing reform agenda being pushed incredibly powerfully by the International Monetary Fund for tax reform, okay? So within that tax reform agenda, there's quite a bit of policy space to use taxes for social purposes. But if we didn't, I noticed that if we didn't make recommendations that actually aligned with that existing agenda, they would basically be put in the bin before they even got to the policymaker's desk, okay? If you want to double the VAT, you're just barking up the wrong tree. The point of a value-added tax is that it's a flat rate tax. It's the same on everything. If you want to implement taxes, the IMF would actually recommend that you use an excise tax mechanism. And I know things are slightly different in the UK with your levy, which again is another approach to doing it. But I just want to emphasise the fact that if we go into these conversations with at least an understanding of what is on the table and what the existing policy environment looks like, we've got a much better chance of actually making policy recommendations stick. The third thing that I want to highlight is the need to engage with the politics. The first point there about taking up opportunities in the economic agendas of these sectors is one that I feel very strongly about. South Africa 2 years ago, maybe 18 months ago, cancelled every bilateral investment treaty that they were a member of. Every single one, okay? They did this to protect policy space for their social policy agendas. But I think it represents a huge opportunity. I'm doing some work with colleagues in South Africa about what it would look like for nutritionists to take advantage of that policy space that is now opening up in South Africa to be able to protect policy space for nutrition. The second issue there, which I think echoes Boyd's point, is about creating these structures that enable dialogue between these sectors, obviously between the health sector and these sectors that govern the food supply chain. And I would also emphasise that this needs to happen at every point in the policy cycle. When we talk about this, you know, how you have conversations, it's usually health coming with something that's pre-prepared, I hate to say. And what we actually need to see is this engagement at an early stage, because I think this will also facilitate specific recommendations that are tailored to the actual context. What is it that agricultural policymakers are dealing with? What is their imperative? How could we work together to have these win-win solutions? I also want to leave you with a bit of hope, because I think this can often, I find when I talk about politics in public health nutrition, it can get quite depressing quite quickly. And so I just wanted to highlight, before I finish, a few examples of where this is actually happening really successfully. And I think there is a huge opportunity to learn from policy initiatives that are happening in different countries of the world. I think this is an incredible opportunity to be able to share understanding not only of the effect of policies on nutrition, but also the politics and the way that engaging with the politics strategically can lead to policy change. In Mexico, the first iteration of their soft drink tax was subject to a formal dispute at the World Trade Organization. And in response, they made it extremely less discriminatory, because it really was at the time, but they also, as most of you would know, had a really compelling social awareness campaign that accompanied the successful iteration of the tax, which has also then been successful in reducing consumption of soft drinks in the country that consumes more soft drinks than any other country in the world. India's new Food Security Act, which was published in 2013, still provides mainly rice and wheat, cheap calories, to their population, but thanks to the strategic advocacy of nutrition groups in India, it also contains provisions for the subsidization of pulses. Okay, there are a lot of people in India calling for a brown revolution, and this, I believe, will really help to shift the incentives in the food supply sector. So there are at least 2 states, including Maharashtra in India, where when you get your subsidized grains, you can also purchase subsidized lentils. Okay, an incredible win from the perspective of nutritional quality. Chile was subject, as every other country that's implemented mandatory interpretive nutrition labelling is, to specific trade concerns at the WTO. And Chile managed to overcome this and go ahead with theirs, in part because of a really strategic investment in transparent justification for their nutritional labelling. They came up with an science, what do they call it in the WTO? Evidence-based scientific justification for their interpretive nutrition labelling, and it's now being implemented. I thought that was a question. I was like, but I'm almost done. I'm obviously talking over time. Ghana also has successfully restricted fatty meat imports and the dreaded turkey tail from their food supply through a really innovative food standards approach. So they've been able to implement a non-discriminatory approach, which has meant that they've avoided the the policy space restrictions that we've seen in other countries that have tried to reduce fatty meats in their food supply. If you don't know what a turkey tail is, it's exactly what it sounds like. So what I want to say in closing is that I think it is very possible to reorient food supplies to deliver nutritional policy. And that may just be because I am an innate optimist, but I really think we need to think of this like turning a big ship around. When you've had 40 years of investment in policy infrastructure to deliver calories, it takes a while to shift that to deliver something else. But we need to think of this, I think, historically, and also engage with it both in a practical policy content sense from that perspective, but also in a political economy and a political sense from that perspective. There's been 40 years of mindsets being established using a problem to address a problem that no longer exists. And when we're talking about addressing the dual burden of malnutrition, of delivering high nutritional quality food supply, we need to be incredibly strategic in how we start to change those policy incentives such that we can deliver nutrition rather than just calories. Thank you.
Thank you to Anne Marie, and you can see there that Anne Marie's work has taken her around the world, and she has the most. If you get to talk to her afterwards, you can ask her about the amazing array of projects that she's got going around the world, which is absolutely fascinating, and I certainly learn a lot from her publications. And thanks for Boyd for giving that global perspective. I think it's so important for us to learn from what is going on at the global level and internationally, and it's always fascinating to me what parallels there are between different countries, including the UK, of course. So thank you very much for those great presentations. And as I said earlier, we welcome questions, comments. We at the Centre for Food Policy believe in the integrated agenda because we think it leads to more effective policy. We think it's a way of getting stuff done. It's an ideas agenda, but it's a doing agenda. It's about designing more effective policy. Do you think the same, or is this all a bit too abstract? What are your thoughts on the presentations? Who would like to start? I'll start with Joanna and then Fiona.
First of all, thank you. Okay, thanks, Corinna. Hi, thank you. I'm Johanna Ralston, and I'm the CEO of the World Obesity Federation, and previously was with World Heart Federation and NCD Alliance. Thank you so much to both of you. Really excellent presentations. I think my question, I sort of know the answer to, but I would be interested in if you agree with the answer, which is what kind of if an integrated approach, if a double win is part of the, and a systems approach is part of the solution to this, what is the appetite of the research funding community to help support this and sort of to really, what is the evidence for this? What are the barriers to securing better evidence? What is the appetite of funders to help support such evidence development?
Hello, I'm Fiona Watson. I'm an independent nutrition consultant. And I've got one question for Boyd and a comment to Anne Marie. Boyd, you talked a lot about sort of national policies and mentioned a little bit about sort of global perspective. But I just wondered if you had a comment, because we know that one of the big problems is that the multinational companies are multinational. So when the Londoners say we don't want to eat biscuits because they've got too much sugar in, then they go to Malawi and sell them there. And not only that, but they'll build a factory there, and there's therefore jobs for people in Malawi. Just a comment on that, how you see that fitting in. And to Anne Marie, I was interested about the calorie fundamentalism. I've worked for a long time in international nutrition, and one of the things looking back was that nutrition got very stuck as a food-based subject a long time ago, and it took a lot of effort to move that away from just being seen as a problem of food, but actually it's a problem of health. And a lot of the improvements in stunting levels is because of better sanitation, breastfeeding, treatment of malnourished children. So I'm just wondering how you think that to prevent it going back, getting stuck in food. We don't want it stuck in health either. But how do you, deal with that?
Thanks very much. Great talk. My name's Patty Arundel from the International Baby Food Action Network, and in the UK it's Baby Milk Action. So good, the two talks, and I loved it. I kept thinking of making a meal when I went on a time management course. They said, think of all these problems as making a meal. If you leave one thing out, it's not going to work. And so I loved, the sandcastle thing of, this is really important, and to get people trained up in asking for policies. I think that's what I've spent so many years doing, and I think it's brilliant. But when I came to you, and then I'm thinking, hold on a minute, who's doing this relation with everybody? I'm just not clear who it is. At the moment, what we have is a whole bunch of civil society, UN, and whatever, all under an umbrella. One of them's called SUN, Scaling Up Nutrition, which I am really worried about. But they're working with corporations, the very corporations that are doing the harm. So they're doing that work that is actually encouraging companies to talk about single nutrients, added this, added that. So those mothers that you're talking about, instead of the rice and dal, they're going for this stuff because that's the single nutrient that the UN as well is pushing. They're pushing that type of nutrition, not biodiverse foods, not local foods, not respecting the right of small farmers to have land. These are so you've got the UN and everyone working with the corporations to get people off the land and grow sugar and grow all this stuff that we don't need and we don't want in our food. So I go a lot to Codex. We've been going for 20 years to Codex. And what we need is real cleanup there, I think, to actually get those companies in their place and not funding dinners and whatever, and actually get the foods properly right so that you don't have them on legally traded as rubbish foods. They even want to put cottonseed oil that isn't even grown for human consumption. We have to fight that type of thing, of really horrible foodstuffs being pushed on the world and poor developing countries having to take it because they don't have the power. So anyway, so I'll stop rabbiting on, but that's, who is it?
Thanks very much for the questions. Excellent question, Patty. I wish there was a simple answer. I think there were a few elements of it. My research interest is, I guess is a disclaimer, it's partly born out of my career start in government. So I worked for the government in Australia and in Fiji. And so when I'm looking at, who am I talking to, it tends to be that single nutrition person buried in a Ministry of Health somewhere who needs to try to engage across sectors. So I think I probably should have started with that disclaimer, but I completely agree. I mean, these challenges of conflicts of interests are huge when it comes to policy making. And I think in some ways, one of the big challenges is that these sectors that govern the food supply are economic sectors. And I think that's something that nutritionists often kind of overlook. We think, food is about nutrition, of course, is a big thing. But for the past 50 years, food has been about economics and about profit. And so by understanding those, again, I'm an optimist, but I think in understanding those historical legacies and owning what the food supply sectors are and what they do, we can start to move forward. I talked to the woman who runs agricultural trade for South Africa last year, and she said to me, look, this is really interesting. And she was amazing. She was saying, what I'd like to see is some visionaries who can actually talk to us coherently about what it's going to look like in 10 or 15 years if we keep down this track. But she said, look, the reason our agricultural trade policy looks like it does is because for the last 20 years, South Africa hasn't cared about agriculture. So we just used agriculture as a bargaining chip in trade agreements, and we gave it away to get concessions in automobile trade and whatever it was that we happened to care about. And that's why we have the food policy that we have, because economists didn't care about it, because we just gave it away. So what do we do now? And I think, so I think you make excellent points. And obviously I think a lot I wanted to answer this question about nutrition stuck in food. I completely understand, and in some ways I think your point about the fact that nutrition is a multi-sectoral issue and we need to be dealing with sanitation and we need to be dealing with education, I think is really pivotal, and in some ways I suspect is the origin of this separation of undernutrition from NCD prevention. My concern is that it's sometimes used as a smokescreen. Like in India, talking to one of the senior agricultural policymakers who sets the minimum support prices for food security, he said, this is really interesting, but I don't really think agriculture is the issue here. It's all about education. It's about WASH. It's about sanitation. You know, those are the sectors that need to be doing stuff. It's not agriculture. We don't have to be doing anything for nutrition. Like literally, that's what he told me. So I guess I would never, you know, and my focus is very much the food supply. So I have no desire to downplay the essential role of these, you know, social protection, of education, particularly women's education, of access to sanitation in ensuring that nutrition is achieved. I mean, it's my bias. I do feel like the food supply sometimes can be neglected in that, because there has been so much focus on those other determinants of malnutrition. So I don't know if that.
Just a couple of quick responses to the other questions. So multinational corporations just sending their junk to poor countries. I mean, they're doing that with tobacco, and they will do it with food. I'm sure they're doing it right now. And that's part of the reason that we've started a global network of measuring food environments across different countries. So there's about 25 or so countries now using common tools to measure food composition and food marketing and practices and food labeling and so on across countries. And so if you see that companies are, you know, selling food which has got more salt or fat in one country than another, and it's the same kind of product, or they don't label it, or they'll label it properly for the high-income countries but not for the low-income countries, those kinds of things. So we do need that kind of network to be able to measure that, to be able to detect it. And in terms of funding research and funding systems research, I have to say it's a struggle. Because I think, and it's something that's a little bit close to me, since I got rejected in a grant, which had a lot of system science in it, and we went to interview, and they said, what has system science ever done? You know, forgetting that we've got 30, 40 years of engineering, and let alone limits to growth and those kinds of things, which are all built on systems models. So I think we've got a lot of education to do within the health research community to understand these tools and to give them validity and allow them to be funded.
Thank you. Anyone see some questions? Okay, I'll start at the front.
Hi, I'm Regina Keith with the University of Westminster Global Public Health Nutrition. So really, first of all, well done. It's a really huge topic, and it's wonderful that we're all sitting here. It's great to see so many friends. I come from the health world of health, and it's lovely having a forum discussing some of these things, because I've been at the forefront, a bit like Patty, all the decisions. The politics, thank you. Again, I've been shouting. The systems, again, I've been shouting a bit too long about all of this. I guess my question really is, and I love that we're looking at countries. I just have one issue about some of the solutions that we as nutrition people are allowing to be perpetrated have the impact. So I'm so glad you were in South Africa, but I don't know if you know that some of the free trade agreements came out of the GAIN agreements, because the people who funded the free fortification of grain in the 5 South African countries did so, and they got the free trade, and they have led to some of the perpetration of some of those negative foods that are now available. Nestle now owns Maggi. I mean, I could go on into all the different countries. The amount of tobacco fields in Malawi that are now producing food because the land, if we had learned the lessons from Mexico rather than the sugar tax, which is a great one to learn, but if we went back to the 70s and 80s when the free trade happened there first in Mexico and the land was sold off and they became tenantless farmers and they then had to be cash purchasers of food. So I guess my query is, and my plea is, please keep global as nutritionists, as we need to fight the system, and don't assume that the other people are making all of these economic agreements. We allowed some of these to happen to get money for our research, for our programs. Why are banana biscuits in India? We bought them there, part of our high-calorie biscuits to reduce malnutrition. So it is now being perpetrated as one of the first GAIN programs in India. And so we are perpetrating some of the solutions. It's our solutions. So we really have to be careful about blaming some of the economic. We have to be very careful and think the chess moves 4 steps ahead. And to the research people, again, sorry, can't help this, but we have 37 students. I'm sure City does. A lot of students need research. If you have research, you're looking for research, small researchers, we are always here with lots of students willing to do research. So I would advocate, 1, keep out the solutions that we put forward, not to stick on food, to keep on the intersectoral, use our own things, just get some innovative solution. Let's work across. We do it all the time with City, it's great. But let's try and fight the multilaterals, look at those, the small print. All right, GAIN should never have been allowed, those 5 countries, those 4, and I won't even go into the companies, but we really need to be looking at the solutions. So please keep some of those things on board. I'm not disagreeing with anything, but just we're not as clean as we sometimes think.
Hi, I'm Rishi Kalachetti. I'm a medical epidemiologist at the Institute of Applied Health Research at the University of Birmingham. I have 2 questions. One is how do you define double burden of malnutrition at a national level? And the second question is, I noticed that several contextual factors weren't mentioned in the presentation, such as I would guess a proportion of those low to middle income countries would be conflict affected. They may have low GDP. They may be particularly food insecure for various reasons. They may be less democratic than countries in high income areas. But that wasn't articulated in the presentation. So I just wanted to know your thoughts on those.
Hi, I'm Nana Quenu. I'm a food policy MSc candidate here at City University. This is actually my area of interest, malnutrition in all its forms and the rise of obesity in developing countries. And my question is, how do you make this conversation more palatable, for lack of a better word, to consumers? Because I had 2 interesting conversations recently. One with a colleague for an organization I volunteer for. And she sat me down before I left and she said, you know, I'm a little worried about you using this word obesity because I'm someone who had a health issue. I have a little extra weight, and they felt that using the word obesity meant that you weren't advocating for health at any size. So I tried to explain that it was about the food system, and 40% of our food is wasted, and all of those things, and it didn't resonate. And I had another conversation with someone at City who was talking about the documentary What the Health, and they totally discounted everything that was said in the documentary about meat because it talked about sugar as being giving a free ride for sugar. So how do we have these conversations with the public?
So let me just have a quick crack at some of those. So the issue around obesity, and obesity as a term, is a real challenge, I have to say. And you often get that pushback at the community level or the individual level. And, within all of the community work that we've done, we don't, it's never framed like that at the at the community level, but it's always kind of there in the background as the compelling reason that you're doing the study or doing the intervention, and often gets talked about as the rationale. But in terms of the communication, it does have to translate and transfer into something which is more palatable. And people get food, people like food, they understand food, and food, I think, is a very good medium to talk about that. In terms of conflicts and so on in low and middle income countries, I think as I understand, the highest prevalence of both stunting, which is the usual measure of undernutrition, apart from micronutrient undernutrition, and overweight or obesity, is in middle income countries, which tend to be more stable perhaps than low income countries. Don't have the conflict zones and so on. Have got into that space of wealth and got the disparities amplified, and the sort of the urban wealthy are starting to get into obesity, and so I think it's more predominant, having a high double burden in middle income countries. And defining undernutrition or double burden, you want to talk about it?
Yeah, so speaking to your question about how to define the double burden of malnutrition, as a rule of thumb, I would talk very much about undernutrition, and the most prevalent problem of undernutrition is stunting, so low height for age, and it's a measure of chronic rather than acute malnutrition, micronutrient deficiencies, and what I would call risk factors for diet-related chronic diseases or diet-related NCDs. So, but I would always defer to Boyd, of course. But yeah, so that would be my sort of rule of thumb. And I think your question about those bigger governance issues is really pertinent. And I think in most countries suffering from conflict, there's almost another dimension to the problem, which is the impact of emergency food relief. And one of my colleagues spent some time working in Palestine, and he was saying actually we're seeing really high rates of childhood obesity because of the nature of the conflict, that you would have these periods, quite short periods of time, where there's emergency food relief, high energy dense food dropped in, the kinds of foods that Patty was talking about, and then you have sort of normalcy in between those, and that actually sort of this unexpected result was really high levels of childhood obesity, because the kids are also quite restricted in their ability to engage in physical activity. So it is a complicated problem, and I think these issues of governance also, I mean, the elephant in the room with most policymakers that I talk to is corruption, right? I mean, this is but then there's also all of these socio-cultural dimensions about how you even define corruption and how governments operate. And I think it is a tension as an academic in terms of thinking about policy content and feasibility, and I guess this is why I'm increasingly interested in historical policy legacies. You know, the impact, as you mentioned earlier, the impact of decisions that were made 30 or 40 years ago, the impact of the World Bank structural adjustment programs for a country like Ghana were enormous. They completely reoriented agriculture to cash crops, right? And so I think engaging with some of these historical legacies can help us to come up with more strategic recommendations and more targeted and contextual recommendations for the countries that we might work in.
I'm Alvaro de Miranda. I'm a retired academic from University of East London. I totally applaud your overall approach and focus on systems and whole rather than the parts. And it seems to me extremely important. However, it seems to me that also that there is a fundamental part of the analysis that's missing, is that the way in which the system that underlies all the other systems operates, namely the capitalist system. you use the words, we're all operating with the same problem. I would totally agree, and that problem is called the capitalist system. And I would argue that unless we build that as part of our analysis, we're not going to be able to have any real effect. So we need to make that upfront, not hide it under a lot of euphemisms. The other, you pointed very correctly to the one of the problems is the lack of public demand for the right policies. And I'm wondering whether we are responsible to a certain extent for that. I wonder whether there isn't, and at the risk of being ostracized from the Center for Food Policy from future and banned from future seminars, I wonder whether there isn't a problem with a policy focus of research, because that tends to create in us a sense that our role is to speak the truth to power, when maybe our role will be to speak the truth to the people and to create in the people, give them the weapons to raise the right demands for the right policies. So I wonder whether we don't need to think about ways in which food policy is not about speaking to power, but is about speaking to the people.
Hi, thanks. I'm Christine Dellon from CRUK. 5% of all cancers in the UK are linked to overweight and obesity. So I was interested in a slightly different topic. Weston Price did a dentist tour of the world in the 1930s, looking at the dental health of people who were not in contact with Western civilization on non-Western diets and comparing the same people when they switched to a Western diet. And when they switched to the Western diet, it was nothing but white flour, sugar, tea, jam, and canned vegetables. So absolutely terrible diet. And he noticed not only did they have terrible teeth, but they also had very snaggly teeth, really bad orthodontics. So he showed all of the people not in contact with Western civilization had beautiful straight teeth, not a single tooth out of place. So then I'm thinking, is orthodontics in Britain, is that a sign of malnutrition? Do we have endemic malnutrition? If orthodontics is malnutrition, which he really showed every single person in these, 10 different drives with perfect straight teeth, with very rich diets. So if orthodontics is malnutrition, isn't it endemic and a bigger problem than we think if we can't even get it right in this country?
Okay. One more?
Thank you. My name is Eric Millstone. I work on food and agricultural policy at the University of Sussex, and I too greatly appreciated both your presentations and agreed with almost everything, but I just wanted to query one thing, and that you said, Anne Marie, and it was in the context of talking about Delhi, where you said there the problem of shortage of calories had been solved. And my thought in response to that was, well, it may have been solved in the context of the urban areas, say in India and in Accra in Ghana or in Nairobi in Kenya, but in the rural areas of parts of Africa and parts of Asia and parts of Latin America, surely it remains the case that there still are significant proportion of people who just still aren't even getting enough calories. And clearly there is much more to nutrition than just calories. But undernutrition of calories surely remains a problem in some locations.
Well, I completely agree. And I think the major problem in these countries is this chronic undernutrition. This is where we see what I would call persistent undernutrition, where we're not seeing declines to the extent that we're seeing the declines in acute malnutrition. But I do agree. I mean, I'm doing some work with the Center for WTO Studies on food security in Malawi, or in a few countries, but Malawi is one of them. Yeah, I mean, when they stopped their food security, their food subsidies as part of IMF reforms in 2000. And then from 2001 to 2003, hundreds of thousands of people died of hunger. I mean, it's so recent. I would definitely agree with you. The acute malnutrition is not over, but I I guess I would argue that it's no longer the major challenge that we're facing. It wasn't directed to me, but I wanted to make a comment on the comment about the underlying challenge of a capitalist economy, or at least an economy that calls itself capitalist, even though most of the major ones don't seem to function in that way. Because I do agree. I mean, I guess I feel like there is this tension between what does it look like to start to turn this ship around in terms of the policy frameworks that we're currently operating in, while also starting to query some of the larger policy paradigms that drive those policy agendas.
So maybe I'll just carry on a little bit from there on the capitalism one, because this is an issue that the Lancet Commission on Obesity is looking at. If you come all the way back to the left-hand side and you look at those underlying drivers, they are around governance, around economics and policies that dictate how all those systems operate. I mean, my personal belief is that what we have now is bad capitalism. I think we need good capitalism, and to me, what's the difference? In the existing system, we allow so much externalization of so many externalities. We allow businesses to maximize and privatize the profits and socialize the costs, either to taxpayers or ratepayers or future generations. And that kind of needs to be, that real problem needs to be closed up. We need to have circular economies, pay the full rates for costs, polluter pays, all that sort of thing. The other thing I think that needs to happen with capitalism, and we talked about this, we're talking about this within the Lancet Commission, is that the other aspects. So that part of it is to take the single financial middle line down to a bottom line, make it a true bottom line. The other parts of the triple bottom line, the sort of social impacts and the environmental impacts, at the moment sit within CSR, which is a kind of a branch of marketing type of thing. We need to have good capitalism. Those things need to be counted in the cost of business. They need to be part of business. They need to be brought and strengthened so that actually the economic impact, the social impacts, which includes health, and the environmental impacts are considered part and parcel of the business model. That's a new model, but actually the current model that we have is not fit for 21st century. And it's driving a lot of the problems. How do we get social impacts and environmental impacts out of marketing and CSR into something a bit more powerful? I don't see how they can be directly regulated as much as the fiscal components are, but we can certainly pull them into a quasi-regulatory space. So in other words, have requirements about what's needed to be reported, and exposure of those, and advocacy from government and from citizens and so on, so that these things are more exposed and they're sort of brought into something and not just determined by the marketing department. In relation to policy-related research, I mean, this centre is a centre of excellence for policy research, but that doesn't mean to say that they forget about the human element and talking with the consumers. And Corinna's a great advocate of this. I think that we do have a job not only to with emotion give the statistics, but give the evidence of the emotion, the evidence of the lived experience, of the real experiences, and the human drama, to be able to bring these statistics to life. And in relation to orthodontics, I've only got anecdotal information because my father was an oral surgeon, and I did ask him in his time why he kept on pulling everybody's wisdom teeth out. What happens? Why does everybody have to lose all their wisdom teeth? And he said his answer was, well, because we're not eating the types of food that need to grow the jaw and make the teeth strong. Our jaws are shrinking, and therefore our teeth are getting crooked, and we need to pull out wisdom teeth to give the existing teeth space. What's that? Yeah, onto softer foods. It doesn't require less whole foods, more processed foods.
Anyone else with further questions?
Hi, I'm Angela Carriedo. I'm doing policy analysis the soda, Mexican soda. I'm from there, and I was there before the PhD. And I don't know, I wanted to share that one of the main things I found when I was interviewing people is the fact that people are tired of the same arguments all the time, you know, like even they said I mean the narratives about framing the problem, they are exhausted. So I think I go differently, and that's very important. And I was trained a long time ago in social marketing, so I was thinking of using some of these strategies, if corporations are using this marketing to let us think or believe and downstream to the policymakers and to the people. So we are running a little bit experiment with the food labeling thing with one student in Mexico, just to trying to see what are the four piece of the marketing. Prestige or other things that were for, and that might in the end, I don't know, just an idea. And what do you think about? Maybe it's too crazy or too. Thank you.
I'm Sharon Noonan Gunning. I've just finished my PhD here at City University at the Centre for Food Policy. And my PhD was around as a policy analysis, but it included interviewing parents of children with obesity. And my background is as a paediatric dietitian. I spent 10 years in child weight management, so my PhD came out of working with parents with very overweight children and just seeing that there was some sort of disconnects going on. So I went to explore the disconnects. And so some of the questions I asked parents was, is government helping or hindering? Overwhelmingly it was that government was hindering, and they gave examples and just spoke about how that was happening. And then also the final question I asked two other questions I asked was, one, what would you do if you were a Prime Minister in terms of food policy? And that generated a lot of information, particularly around their material conditions, because the parents they interviewed were bus driver mums, bus driver dads, mums on benefits, self-employed mums as childcare workers, because most women have been forced into self-employment, some earning only terrible amounts of money a day, £40 a day, £25 a day, looking after kids. So there's been a big push on people's wages. So a key thing for these parents was their material conditions. It was about their wages, it was about their hours. You had mums on 0-hour contracts who were feeding, one mother was feeding her client, had Parkinson's disease at a time when so had to leave her children's food in the fridge. And now the chief medical, and now there's sort of issues being said in Britain about parents not leaving food in the fridge for their children. So these are the realities of what people face, and also what they see in their communities around their food environments, around their foodscapes. Comments that people know that the fast food outlets was the main issue that they wanted change in terms of a policy solution. They wanted that changed. The language that parents used was of food being these foods being dumped in their communities, loads of language like that. That really what underpinned that was that they understood that they were being discriminated against through food, and that through food policy and through health policy that was mediating that discrimination, that in turn was stigmatising them around words like obesity, because in Britain words like obesity is tied to child neglect. And it just feeds on to this, at the community level, a feeling of stigmatisation, a feeling of discrimination, which then builds social division. And so when we want to build a social movement around food, and we face this and around the right to nutrition, then we do face these social divisions that come through policy onto the ground. And then so for people's engagement, what parents said about, yes, they should be involved in policy making. They said that what stopped them being involved in policy making was the hours of work, was their conditions. counsellors that I interviewed also talked about democracy deficit, that there is not the means to enable parents to be involved in policy making. And so there's a whole question of democracy that needs to be tied up to the questions of food rights as well, and how do we enable true democracy, meaningful democracy, to allow parents, in my case, these parents to be involved in policy making around food and child obesity. So I do think we do need, so just to quickly finish, it's the issues about social movements, and really how do we, like at ground level, we have to think about the slogans that we use. And I do think the question of nutrition quality is a key thing, because people know they're getting fed poor quality food, and so nutrition quality raises the issue of nutrition inequality, and so I think that could be a good slogan to use. I think it is a question of, if we're going out to try and engage people at grassroots level, we do need ideas to counter the neoliberal capitalist ideas that is dividing people, but ones that are going to unify people, so we can build movements, positive movements around food. So it's just really, I think that, and also that we should work together. And if we have got students, then we do need to do more grassroots work as well. But it's just ideas around social movements, really.
Anyone last questions? I'll just have two last questions, and then.
Hi, I'm Stephanie. I'm actually a master's student here at Center for Food Policy. My research is actually on this area, so I've read quite a bit of your work, both of you. I am actually studying Tanzania's policies, and they just launched a multi-sectoral nutrition action plan that talks about double duty actions and the double burden of malnutrition. So I was talking to a few policymakers, and the issue that, obviously it was kind of a success that, they have this policy, but the issue was they didn't involve the people on the ground. And one of the policymakers said that it's really important to include them, because I guess, as the previous person mentioned, was that people on the ground do not see the issues as multi-sectoral. They just see issues as problems of livelihoods. They don't see nutrition as, okay, this is got to do with my transport, right? But the problem is they are not involved, because for whatever reasons, and they don't see the need to be involved as well, because they don't know that, nutrition policies affect me, or they don't even know that such policies exist. And a lot of, I'm not sure about the UK or Australia, but a lot of politicians do not want to include them, because maybe they think it takes too long or whatever. Actually, all the people I interviewed said they do not know why they don't include them. So that was probably an issue to look at. So my question that I'm getting to is, how do you get people to get involved? Or how do you get the politicians to get the people involved? And how do you empower them to have a strong enough voice to have policy change?
Thank you. I know that we're at the official end of our session, so I'm going to just indulge us and have one more. Do you want to ask? And then go to you, and then we'll end.
Thank you. Jodie Harris, I'm a nutrition policy researcher at the Institute of Development Studies in Sussex. I just wanted to pick up a little bit on Eric's point about hunger. We've, as international nutritionists, we've been really moving away from a focus on calorie production and pushing a focus on diversity of foods in the food system, which is obviously incredibly important. But we saw last week the FAO hunger numbers, undernourishment numbers, have risen for the first time in many years. And it's the same in many contexts that I've worked in. We have high levels of stunting and sometimes even higher levels of hunger. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts, because it's something that I'm still struggling with, on how we don't throw the issue of hunger out while still, of course, focusing on the issue of undernutrition and better diet quality as well as quantity.
Just in the interest of time, probably taking most of those as kind of comments, but just very quickly from my perspective, I think The question was around social marketing at policymakers and framing it for policymakers. I think that's fundamental, and I don't think we're very good at it. I don't think in public health we're not very good at the messages and the social marketing and the framing to the public or to policymakers. But smart social marketing, in my view, has the policymakers as a key audience, and we need to take a leaf out of the marketer's book for that. How do we get people involved? It is interesting to me that food is something that everybody does engage with, at one level, and it's actually relatively easy to get people to engage with food and talk about food at a kind of almost as an individual level, but then how do you engage with it collectively? How do we go from that kind of individual personal experience that they have all the time to making it a collective thing? And again, I think that probably is around framing. The food, I'd like to think that kind of food sovereignty and some ownership and of food is a good way of framing, but that concept's been around for a while and doesn't seem to have sort of taken light. So I don't know really what the answer is, how we frame it to get movements, but those are my thoughts.
Thanks very much. Great questions. In response to your comment about how you get people involved, I think there's a couple of dimensions to this. And I mean, Boyd's talked a bit about social marketing. I would also argue that often the people, when you say people on the ground, as a policy researcher, I think of the implementers. I think of the people who are working at community level. I was doing some work in Fiji last year and talked to the education staff who were working on the ground, and one of them had all these interesting ideas about how to get healthy local food into boarding schools. And he said, I wanted to work with agriculture, so I sent a memo up so it could go across and then it could go down and I would be allowed to work with the agricultural people. And that was 18 months ago. And so I think some of the people who are neglected and who have really, really good ideas, I mean, his ideas were fantastic. I was like, the policy people need to hear about your ideas because you're the person on the ground. So in addition to the social marketing and engaging with consumers, I mean, everyone's a consumer, right? But I think it's also, from a policy perspective, to engage with the implementers is absolutely essential. Not only because it means things get implemented, but also because they do have brilliant ideas. And in response to your comment about the rising hunger rates, I think, one of the big challenges is the fact that if we still keep thinking about the fact that people just need food and it doesn't matter what quality it is, we're really just setting ourselves up for this diabetes, heart disease explosion, which I think countries just can't afford. So I do agree that it's, and I feel like there's so many things I could have said and didn't have time to say, but I do agree with you. I mean, the problem of hunger is not over. And particularly this pervasive food insecurity, I think, is one of the biggest challenges. And the fact that you've got obesity coexisting with food insecurity is one of these huge challenges. And the more research we can do on how people access foods, I mean, I guess, and obviously working with IDS, you're across this, but dealing with also with supply chains, I think thinking about how people get food is going to be increasingly important, and identifying policies that are really specific. I've just been doing some work in India with PHFI on fruit and vegetable supply chains to try to understand why they're not getting to people in any sort of affordable way in India. So how, and one of the comments from some of the policymakers we talked to was that perhaps one of the strengths of a public health approach, because obviously this is not our area of expertise, but one of the strengths that I think we bring is looking at this from the consumer perspective and being able to see food and food supply chains, and not just as logistical challenges, but actually as, well, who needs to get them and how do they get there? I hope that helps answer.